Well, good morning. I want to thank you all for taking time to be here with us today at the Field Crops Virtual Breakfast. Today we have with us Abby Smith with NRCS, the National Natural Resource Conservation Service. She's our state agronomist for Michigan, and she's here to talk with us about conservation practices for soil health. Abby.
Good morning, everyone. All right. Thank you for having me this morning to talk about conservation practices. We have over 130 practices in our field office technical guide, so we're going to focus on soil health this morning. Just a little bit about NRCS before we begin. For more than 80 years, NRCS has helped farmers make investments in their operations to keep their working lands working and improve the quality of their soil, water, air, plants, and animals. Our mission is to help deliver conservation solutions so agricultural producers can protect natural resources and feed a growing world. We are part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And before we begin talking about conservation practices this morning, I thought it would be important to take a minute and talk about conservation planning first. Conservation planning is the process that we use to identify what conservation practices are needed on the land to address resource concerns. Resource concerns are problems that are impacting the sustainability or the intended use of the land. We have over 40 resource concerns that we work on that range from soil, water, air, plants, and animals. So we use conservation practices to treat those resource concerns. And how this conservation planning process works is that we start first with a problem or an opportunity. And so farmers, you know your land best. As you're working your ground this spring, you can make note of things that you see that need improvement. You can identify resource concerns with a conservation district employee, a MEP technician, with MSU Extension's help, or with NRCS's help. Once we identify that problem, then we're going to figure out what the goals are for the operation and inventory the resources. And so inventorying the land might be a tool that we run in the office. We may need to collect some data in the field to run that tool. It may be an assessment that we do out on the land. It may be just a visual assessment, us going out and looking at what's going on. Most often it's a combination of all of those in order to get a good picture of what's happening. We use that data to formulate alternatives and determine what is going to be best on that land to address those resource concerns. And we're going to formulate some alternatives and present them to the producer. We really need producer involvement in this process. We want that conservation plan to represent the producer's operation and make sure it's going to meet the producer's needs and fit within their equipment and their crops and continue to help them be profitable. So once we have a decision from the producer about what practices they want to see out of those alternatives, we're going to create a plan. And that plan is going to include maps and soil data and also what we call implementation requirements. So implementation requirements are basically prescriptions for each of the practices. They're going to tell you what to plant, how to plant it, when to plant it, and all the other information. That plan may also include engineering designs if you have engineering practices that you'd like to install. But that plan is going to tell you everything that you need to know to put those conservation practices on the ground. For some practices, we may have financial assistance available. You may have heard of EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, or RCPP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. Those are all opportunities for financial assistance to cover a portion of the cost of installing those conservation practices. So the planning process doesn't stop after implementation of the practices. We'll evaluate the success of those practices and make sure they address the resource concern and make any adjustments that are needed. So we can transition and talk just a little bit about soil health for a minute. Soil health, we define it as the continued capacity of the soil to function and be a vital living ecosystem to sustain our plants and animals and us. And so the soils are really important to making sure that we have that physical stability and have a place for those roots to live, cycle nutrients, regulate water, and filter pollutants in the soil. So when we're working with soil health, we use what is called the Cropland Infield Soil Health Assessment. And this is an assessment that we do out in the field. We need some data from the producer because some of the indicators are have a timeliness factor, and we'll never be out there right at the right time to do all the indicators. So we need some information from the producer to help complete this. They're pretty simple indicators in that they don't need a lot of specialized equipment. Most of them just take a shovel and a visual assessment to look and get a good picture of the soil. We use this tool to help us determine if the 4 soil health resource concerns are met. And I'll put a link in the chat when I'm finished speaking right to that tool, because it is available publicly. Producers can use it on their own if they don't want to work on it with NRCS. One of the tests that we do is the water stable aggregate test. There's a picture on the screen of the strainer method that we do. A soil aggregate, it is multiple soil particles bonded together with organic matter, and they're bonded together by exudates from plants or mycorrhizal fungi or other soil microorganisms. And that glue helps form those aggregates from those soil particles. And so this water stable aggregate test that we can do out there with just some cups and some sink strainers and a hard surface to turn the soil out on tells us a lot about the soil and all 4 soil health resource concerns. How you do this test is you take a sample of soil. I like to take a sample from the field edge or fence row and compare it to the field. And you crumble that soil up in your hand a little bit. You don't want to grind it up. You're just looking to break up any large clods. Put it in the sink strainer and then submerge it in the water for a minute. And then you're going to turn it out onto a hard surface. And what we're looking for, the comparison that always sticks with me is, we want cake, not pudding. So we want it to look like chocolate cake, not chocolate pudding. The soil on the left here on the image, you can see the aggregates are still together. There's not runoff coming off of it. If there is runoff, it's usually clear. We can still see those pore spaces, and our soil aggregates did not disintegrate in the water. The soil on the right here has disintegrated. It looks more like pudding. It's spread out. We're not seeing those distinct pores. So we use that test as a measure of aggregate stability. And we use this because it's really important to all the soil functions to have water stable aggregates. They're more resistant to erosive forces like wind and water, and that pore space is going to help us with infiltration and holding water through the growing season, as well as air exchange. On the screen is another way that we can test that aggregate instability using a mesh screen suspended in a jar of water, and telling if that soil clod will hold together in that water. Another resource concern that we look at is soil compaction, and specifically management-induced compaction. Compaction is reduction in the pore spaces. So anytime we are applying pressure to the soil, like through traffic, and those soil particles get moved closer together and we reduce pore space, that is compaction. This is going to reduce productivity and infiltration and aeration in our soils as well. Another resource concern, the third one, is soil organism habitat loss and degradation. And we know that most of the soil processes are driven by our soil biology. So it's really important to have a home for our organisms to live and food that they need, because those relationships between our plants and the microorganisms are really important, like our rhizobia bacteria producing nitrogen for us in legumes, and making our nutrients plant available. And then the final resource concern that we look at is organic matter depletion, and all the pools of soil organic matter, so the recently dead to the material that has been dead for a long time. Organic matter is important to stabilizing our soils and cycling nutrients and holding water for us. So when we look at implementing practices, we focus on the 4 principles of soil health. And so those are maximizing living roots, minimizing disturbance, maximizing biodiversity, and maximizing soil cover. On your screen is some practices that can be used to address those 4 principles. And so we want to design a system of practices that work together that are going to address all 4 of those principles to the maximum extent that we can. That's really how we get those resource concerns addressed. And we'll talk for just a few minutes about a couple of those. One of our most popular practices is cover crops. It's code 340 if you're looking at our field office technical guide, and I'll put a link to that in the chat as well. These are plants that we plant for seasonal vegetative cover, so they're not harvested as a crop. They're going to protect our soil surface, reduce erosion, and increase soil health for us. So I get this question a lot, what cover crop should I plant? And it's really a combination of factors. We need to look at what resource concern we want to treat to make sure we pick a species that's going to do that for us. We need to make sure it's going to work with the crops that are in rotation, and also our planting and management methods. Especially termination, and MSU Extension has a really great publication on termination of cover crops. So making sure the species that we plant are going to fit within our management. And then another thing that's really important is making sure it fits within our windows of opportunity in our cropping system. So wheat is a great crop to follow with some cover crops because we have that nice long window after harvest to plant those species, and we can plant warm season species because of the timing. And so we start with a great long list of cover crop species, but once we consider all four of these factors, we really narrow it down to a few species that will work really well. Another popular practice, it's actually two practices, is residue management. We have two different levels that are based on the intensity of the tillage that's done. We have no-till and then reduced tillage. And here we are managing the plant residue and limiting soil disturbance in order to keep the ground covered. And there is some air quality benefits and energy benefits as well, and increasing organic matter. Another common practice that we work on is conservation crop rotation. And so this is adjusting the sequence of crops that are grown over a period of time. So that rotation, making adjustments to that to help keep the ground covered and rotate between different carbon to nitrogen ratio crops and including legumes, rotating crop families to help control disease, and including high residue species in there as well. So when we build these soil health management systems, we're focusing on those four principles of soil health. We want our soils to be resistant to disturbance events that are happening, and then resilient in that they can return to that pre-disturbance state quickly. And how we do this is by implementing these systems of practices. So all of our practices have criteria that we use to plan them appropriately to address the resource concerns. And that's all going to be in that implementation requirement document that the producer will receive. So on the screen is an example of how we could use those three practices that I just covered to focus in on all four of those soil health principles. And so we would use that conservation crop rotation to maximize biodiversity and maximize a living root. And then the cover crops could help us with maintaining soil cover, maximizing biodiversity and a living root system. And then we can use no-till to help us limit that soil disturbance and maximize soil cover. And so here you can see we've addressed all four of those soil principles and used multiple practices to do that. And then, when we're implementing these conservation plans, we don't intend for the producer to make all the changes in 1 year. The goal is to, work this into the producer's operation so that we maintain yield and we're not having production losses. So here's an example of how we could step into a soil health management system. Starting at the bottom here, a producer that's in a corn soybean rotation with conventional tillage. Their first step might be to start to no-till those soybeans. And then after that, we introduce wheat that's also no-tilled. So we've limited our disturbance there twice now. And then we follow that wheat with a cover crop, maybe a cover crop mix because of that nice long window that we have to establish it. After that, we focus in on starting to no-till the corn as well. We have a higher functioning soil here because we have that cover crop in there and we've done some no-till already. And then the final step might be to add in a cover crop after corn. And so in that kind of final step in this screen, we have the ground covered during all of the non-growing season when the crops aren't present with cover crops or the wheat. We have a lot of diversity in there with cover crop mixes. And we've maintained soil cover as well. That was a small representation of our conservation practices. Like I said, we have 130, over 130 in our field office technical guide that we work on. If you're interested in starting the conservation planning process, you can scan the code on your screen to contact your local field office. I'll also put a link in the chat to the contact information so you can visit your local field office and ask them about conservation planning. Thank you for having me today.
Thanks, Abby. I think at this time we're going to start taking some questions. So I'm looking in the chat. Looks like Jeff's been answering questions all along. Um, Given that weather report, Jeff, I'm pretty sure my kids are going to try to put a tent up in the backyard this weekend. So
it may be time. It may be time. Except for the rain, maybe.
Yeah. I know, here's something from Dennis. He has a couple slides and he wants to share about wheat damage. I'll give you permission, Dennis. If we can make Dennis a host so he can share his slides, that would be great. I think we had another question about
or I can wait until the questions are done for Abby and Jeff too. Doesn't matter to me.
Okay. Oh, here's a question from Mike Stanton for Abby. So Mike says, wheat acts like a cover crop by providing winter cover and living roots, however, is not as profitable as corn or soybeans. Because of this, it is not planted on as many acres as it should be. Is there any discussion at NRCS or FSA to provide an incentive payment for producers to plant more wheat?
So we do have financial assistance available for conservation practices through NRCS. And so producers who are considering changing their crop rotation to include wheat may be eligible for some of that financial assistance. So that is already offered through NRCS. It may not offset all the cost of that practice though. So that is a consideration, but producers can implement soil health management systems on cropland that does not include wheat too. There's still ways to get the ground covered and maintain that living root system.
Thank you. One of the earlier questions we had was a question about drought conditions in a field, when they will dry up, and when we can get the ground worked. Jeff talked about that a little bit, and it looks like it's going to be pretty wet. So is that kind of the general answer there, Jeff?
Yeah, and of course, as usual, there's always it depends, but because the soil texture obviously has a major role here as well, and so we're going to be able to get back to those or get into the fieldwork activity obviously on the coarse textured soils first, and the heavier ones will and especially given the forecast, if we do have opportunities, it probably will be on lighter soils here over the next week, but. You also saw the map with the precip. So the farther north and west you go in the state, probably the lower the odds are that things will be dry enough, and reverse of that in the southeast. So and I think one thing we've learned over time, I mean, Michigan's always a challenge in the spring to get things done, but you've got to be ready. And I know most people are at a moment, because sometimes the opportunity arrives and we didn't expect it, or it's a gift, but use it. That's I think we learn that season after season, and I suspect there will be some opportunities maybe in places like the southeastern lower here over the week, even with a wet forecast.
All right, thanks. Eric asked, with higher air temperatures starting Friday, we should not have any issues with chilling with cold rain water, correct?
Are we thinking about imbibition, or what you know?
Yeah.
What the yes, yes. Our soil temperatures, as I showed earlier, are actually fairly mild for this time of the year. But given the forecast, especially in the southern half of the state, with into the 70s and with strong sunshine, at times this should not be an issue. And if at anything, maybe the far north, but we're not to that point yet where people are really pulling the trigger on, or able to get out. So I don't think that that's going to be an issue here in any time, and certainly not in the near term future.
All right. For Abby, what are the major barriers to expanding long-term no-till acres, and how can these be overcome? That's a big question.
Yeah, that is a very big question. No, it's a very good question. I think part of it is expanding the knowledge about long-term no-till and how to implement no-till successfully. And I think that part of that is, talking today about these soil health management systems and how we can do that, and then increasing producers' knowledge of NRCS and how we can help them convert those acres.
Thank you. Josh asks, what is the best option or cost-effective option to put cover on corn? Will rye work late in the season?
Yeah, rye is pretty inexpensive as far as cover crop species go, and it is our species that we can plant the latest into the season. So it's a good option after corn, especially if you fly it on in August or September.
In the past, NRCS had large mixes of cover crops that they recommended. Do farmers have more flexibility in choosing a 1, 2, or 3-way cover crop program?
So there are options for producers. They can pick a single species, they can pick a multi-species mix, and that can be as complex as they'd like to make it, as long as it meets the seeding windows. And we want to make sure those species get seeded at times when we know they'll germinate and grow successfully. So, but there
I
are
heard some, oh, sorry.
Oh, there's just different levels of financial assistance based on the mixes that are selected. So
I heard some talk that the seeding windows were going to be expanded. Is that true?
we are always looking at adapting our practice standards, and there's some studies going on at our Plant Materials Center right now about seeding windows and seeding rates. And so we always take that current information and adapt it into our standards when they're revised.
Thank you. I got a question from Mike. NRCS used to conduct annual tillage system residue cover assessments, or we used to call them transects. Are these still conducted? And if so, are the reports available?
No, they're not still conducted, so there's no reports about that.
I have a question for Dennis. How does this frost affect herbicide application on winter wheat, grass, and broadleaves? Previous sprayed and spraying today, frost and cold tonight, more wet coming. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so the cold temperatures definitely can impact herbicide application. As a general rule of thumb, you want to have an average temperature of 50 degrees for 3 days in a row and hit that middle day when you're making your herbicide application. So you don't want frost injury just the day before or frost injury just the day after. And the wheat growth stages are advancing quite rapidly. And so there are some herbicides that are no longer able to be applied because they can only be applied up to Feek 6. And a lot of places are now into Feek 7 or even approaching Feeks 8. So by this time, there may be enough canopy cover if the weed pressures are not great. If you have just a small amount of weeds out there, the wheat may shade it out and you might not even need to put a herbicide on. So that's a walking and scouting each field, one field at a time to see what's really out there to make that decision. But yeah, we got to have warmer temperatures to put some of these herbicides on.
All right. Any other specialists want to chime in on herbicides? All right. Well, if you want to, maybe you can do it in the chat. Chris Stefanzo has a little report she wants to let everybody know about. So I'm just going to read that out loud. There's 21 black cutworms in my trap on campus, more than normal, but still not an intensive capture. Likely moved on recent rain event. Okay. What is delay in planting when using cover crops due to soil not drying as, so how long do you need to delay plant when you're using cover crops due to the soil not drying quickly with more ground cover?
Well, I think that is a pretty big question because it's going to depend on the species that are planted. Our non-winter killed species are going to help take up moisture in the spring too. I think the important part is just making sure that we're planting when the ground is ready instead of by a calendar, and getting those cover crops either terminated 2 weeks prior to planting or after planting, so that we get those proper conditions for planting.
Mhm. Yeah, I like that soil temperature map you had, Jeff. That's really helpful. And I think Bill, somebody put the link in the chat too. So Mike asked Jeff, is the rainwater going to be cold from the coming events?
And I think this one we have pretty high confidence. No, this will be a warm season type of situation this weekend, and so not expecting a. We have had a couple of those events in the last month, but this should be warm, convective rain. The upper atmosphere is relatively warm, so no, we're not looking for any cold. It will be relatively warm rainwater, well, relative for the time. But again, I think by Sunday, if we do see 80 degrees, everybody's going to say, what just happened here with a 25-degree start on Thursday morning and then jumping literally into the season here in just a couple days. But the rain should be relatively warm.
Nice. Dennis, is Husky herbicide still good to spray on wheat?
Yes, Husky can be sprayed up to flag leaf. So products like 2,4-D, MCPA, Clarity, Curtail, Perfect Match, Osprey, PowerFlex, those are only up to Feek 6. So if you're planning on using those products, make sure go stage your wheat.
All right.
Oh, for sure.
Eric asks, burn down apps made last week have been slow to take effect with colder temps. Can we expect a dramatic increase in efficacy by the end of the weekend? Did the frost events impact expected efficacy? Is there a specialist on that can answer efficacy questions of herbicides?
That would be an Aaron or Christy question, I think.
Yeah. All right. Well, if they're on and they're listening, happy to chime in, or you could chime in the chat. Dennis, why don't you go ahead and get your slides ready? It looks like our questions are kind of slowing down. Mike said, Abby, it looks like NRCS is in good hands, and I think we all agree. So we really are happy that you're with us as our state agronomist.
So wheat is in the jointing stage right now, and wheat can tolerate down to 24 degrees Fahrenheit for about 2 hours, and this is the approximate injurious temperature. And things to look for are death of the growing point, leaf yellowing or burning, lesions, splitting, or bending of the lower stem, and like a silage odor. And the yield effect can be moderate to severe at this growth stage. So I don't think any of us are in the boot stage yet, although just to the south of us, they are in the boot stage, and then that a critical temperature bumps up to 28. So the way that you can get information is go to the MSU EnviroWeather, and then I always go to the weather tab here, and I go to data in demand. And after you go here, it shows up the list of weather stations. And so you can click on any weather station. I'll just go click on this one. And this one happens to be Mount Pleasant. And then I go to hourly data. And then in this chart, and I'll blow this up just a little bit. In this chart, you can see the temperature data. So here's air temperature here. And so at 1 a.m., this site was down to 30. 28, 27, 27, 26, 25. So we are getting really close to that temperature where we can see some frost damage. So If you are concerned about that, go to this EnviroWeather and then find a weather station near you to see what the hourly temperature is. But if you suspect damage, what you're looking for is the growing point, which is this is the developing head in the stem. If this frosts and then cells rupture, what can happen is that you can end up with sterile spikelets, like what you see in these two pictures over here at the bottom right. Sometimes you can find earlier on the stem is kind of bent. That happens. Then this leaf burning is another one. And then if you're smelling a silage odor, you're probably looking at stems that are turning brown, and basically those plants are dead at that point. So I've got a lot of questions in the last couple of days about what the frost's going to do. Hopefully this helps clear up a little bit. It's not an exact, it's not, well, it has to get down to exactly 24 before you can see injury or damage, but that's a ballpark for 2 hours at that time frame. You can kind of see, and we were getting pretty close to that here over the last evening.
Dennis, it's just Jeff, and I've just been looking at some values here from EnviroWeather, and we're right at that, or just maybe just above that threshold, in a large part with the Saginaw Valley and parts of the Thumb. Unfortunately, we got close. So
Yep.
that's especially that area of the state you're going to probably want to be watching or having a close look.
Yeah, and to assess for damage, you can't go out there today or tomorrow and look and find it. You got to wait 7 to 10 days before this damage will start to actually appear in the field. The leaf burning will show up a little bit more quickly, but the bending and this, the death of the stems, that will show up later. And of course, the heads, you won't know that until they emerge. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Ruth, are these temps at plant or at the weather station height?
Well, so that's a good question. The temperature by the weather stations are reported at 5 foot ground height. Is that right, Jeff?
5 feet above the surface. That's right.
Yeah, so the soil will provide some warming buffer closer to the soil surface. So it depends on what growth stage you're at. The closer that growing point is to the ground, the little bit more buffering effect you'll have. So, and perhaps wind might play a role in there too.
And some of these, I'm sorry, so, real quick, some of those rules are actually made with the air temperatures at 5 feet, even knowing that the actual temperature down and Dennis, you're right on. The temperatures at the plant surface or on the leaf surface are probably a couple degrees colder than that, than the 5 foot. But sometimes those rules of thumb come because that's what we have data for and have observations for. So just to simplify things, I'll say that 24 Fahrenheit is a threshold. Many times that does refer to that 5 foot air temperature. And again, there are a lot of 20, 24 and a half, 25, 26s right now in that east central part of the state.
There were questions about herbicides affecting cover crops after wheat, and we had also had temperature and burn down questions. Karen attempted to answer that for Christy in the chat. So there's a couple paragraphs in there if you want to check in on those. It looks like Christy has some research on those questions, and then if you need further information, go ahead and email Christy your questions. All right. I want to thank Abby again for being our guest today. And we appreciate everybody for being here with us this morning, and we hope you have a great week.